Welcome everyone to our second virtual tasting. This time we're joined by Nick Taylor, who is one of the brothers and founders of Found North Whiskey. Nick and Zach, his brother, has been just fantastic people to work with on a number of different projects. But just if you're just joining us, if that prelude that Nick just gave us about the ethanol and the whole breaking bourbon kind of thing wasn't enough, that's what you can expect from this tasting. More importantly, we're going to be tasting some whiskeys, which I think is always a plus. So with that being said, Nick, ball's in your court. Go ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, guys. Thanks for having me, Michael. Of course, I'm delighted to be here, and I've been in the Discord for a while, so it's nice to put some faces to Discord handles. But thank you for having me. The big thing I would say is I actually really appreciate questions. I always have. A lot of times you get a feel for where the audience wants to go, which is actually what I'd rather do. So how many of you guys have had Found North before? I know, Chris, you've got it I know you've got it back there, but do we have people who are new to Found North? Give me just like a thumbs up if you're new to Found North, or a hand up or whatever. Okay, cool. All right. So I founded Found North with my brother, Zach. We launched in April of 2001. So we're very much a new brand, still in that kind of new phase, which is always fun. And basically the premise of this company was pretty straightforward. We wanted to make old rye. And basically a lot of the old rye, well, pretty much all of the old rye that you see on the market these days is from Canada. There's a little bit that's actually made in the US, but if you look back to like even just 2000, in 2000, 50,000 cases of rye were sold in the United States total, right? So basically this was a completely dead category. So naturally there's no aged rye lying around in the US. And so when we were looking at brands that were bottling old rye, it was very clear that it was all coming from Canada. And it often is stated, sometimes indirectly. It'll say, we're the oldest rye whiskey made here, and then at the bottom in fine print it'll say sourced from Alberta or sourced from, and you're like, okay, well. So when we saw that, we said, okay, so there's this great rye in Canada, and we're just going to be really upfront about the fact that we're sort of sourcing it from Canada. Hence the name Found North, right? This isn't some crap about grandma's recipe or, some whatever nonsense marketing story. We just said, okay, this is where we're from. This is where we're getting the whiskey from, and this is why. And as we got deeper into it, what we actually learned that I think has kind of changed the course for us was we learned a lot more about how Canadian whiskey is made, and why it's made that way. And the more we sort of dug into it, the more we found that Canadian brands they're basically taking 100% grain, so 100% rye, 100% corn, 100% wheat, 100% barley. They're fermenting, distilling, aging it separately, blending it at the end. And the idea is to effectively create like a palette with a bunch of paints and make the paints, and then the master blender's job is to paint the picture. And so Canadian whiskey really is intended to be blended. And what we were seeing was American brands were buying Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye, and treating it like it's MGP, right? Okay, here's a lot of whiskey. It's a done whiskey. I'm just going to bottle it. And you see this happening to this day. A lot of these super old corn whiskeys that come out of Canada, they're literally just buying one lot. They're not actually blending it. They're just buying a singular component, which is really not how Canadian whiskey is intended to be made. It's a very incomplete product. Meanwhile, the Canadians are taking Canadian whiskey, they're blending it and using it the way it's intended, but then they're watering it down, chill filtering it, and adding caramel coloring, which is basically doing all of these things that are turning the premium American whiskey drinker off of their products. And so for us, we decided we could live very neatly in between these two processes. We could treat Canadian whiskey like Canadian whiskey by blending it and combining the grains at the end. But we weren't going to chill filter it, water it down, add any additives. And that was basically the basis of our brand. The interesting thing is, and this is probably a good time to pull out batch 3 if you guys are chomping at the bit to drink something, which I am. So effectively, the first whiskey we made was very much like batch 3. It was batch 1. It was a cask strength rye, similar grain ratio. This one is 64% rye, 32% corn, 4% malted barley. And when we made it, this was everything that we wanted to do with rye. We wanted to use really, really old components. We wanted to take advantage of the oxidative process. And we wanted to mess around with whiskeys that were not so far outside of what you're used to that that it doesn't taste like anything. I've had sort of some weird single. I used to be a single malt hound myself, and I've had some single malts that taste so dissimilar to the single malts that I'm used to. It's hard for me to decide if I even like them. Right? Like, you need some point of reference for whiskey. This is representative of the flavor profile of rye, or we'll get there with the whiskey. But if this is the representative of the flavor profile of rye, we don't want to be way out here. We don't want to be like outside of the profile of what we used to, but we very much want to be on the edge. And working with Canadian components, one, we were working with age statements that people don't have access to. Which gives you a whole profile that you just otherwise can't get. Age being a very, very important aspect of not just wood interaction, but actual age, which I can talk about in a minute, has a huge impact on the flavor. But additionally, the Canadians don't put everything in new oak. In fact, they rarely do. A lot of times they're putting it in used oak. Sometimes they're transferring into different species of oak. So a lot of the components we were using were Hungarian oak, ex-Speyside Scotch casks, sometimes new wood, sometimes we used ex-wheated bourbon barrels. I mean, all kinds of funky stuff. And we were able to really blend it to a profile that we liked, that we thought American consumers of premium bourbon, premium rye would really like. But just get outside of kind of the center. Which is the main reason why, by the way, we didn't start with MGP whiskey. I see here there's a question: is everything sourced from Canada? Yes, absolutely everything. Yeah, okay. So Paul asks a great question here. Paul asks, just to be clear, this isn't a mash bill per se. It's 100% rye, 100% corn, 100% malt in a ratio of 64-32-4, correct? Almost exactly right, Paul. So historically, the historically Canadian and American whiskey was made exactly the same way, with the same influence. Really, up until the early 1900s, Canadians were making whiskey with a mash bill. And the reason there is a mash bill in general is because of the enzyme content in barley. So barley has naturally occurring enzymes that convert starch to sugar incredibly efficiently. And so when you soak the barley, you activate that enzyme, and it will not only cultivate the starch in the barley to sugar, but it will do so for the corn and the rye. And so the barley was always in there as a tool for efficiency. Canadians, and actually Americans at the same time, but Canadians developed a way of adding enzymes so that they did not need barley, which is what allowed them to start making these 100% corns, 100% rye, etc. That being said, some of the distilleries in Canada will still use a little bit of malted barley, even as they are adding enzymes when they make rye. And so in the case of this 64-32-4 ratio, the 4 is actually coming from the rye component. We didn't sprinkle in a little bit of barley on purpose. We just wrote it in there because we wanted to be very accurate about where all of the liquid was coming from, and there is a portion that is coming from barley. That being said, your question is very apt, because mash bill and liquid ratio are fundamentally different. When you do a mash bill, you're doing it by the weight of the grain. And the reason that's actually important is because rye and corn do not have the same starch content. In fact, corn has nearly twice as much starch in it as rye does. And so from a math standpoint, when you're distilling, the percentage alcohol that you get is not by increasing the alcohol, it's actually by removing the water. So if you fundamentally back solve, if you have like a 7% beer that you're going to distill up to 70% alcohol by water, you're not adding 63%. What you're doing is you're subtracting 90% of the water, literally, that you're separating the alcohol from 90% of the water, which means that starting point, that starting percentage beer that you're at makes a huge difference to how much alcohol you're actually going to end up with. And that beer's percentage is based on the starch content. So if you follow that all the way back, if you're doing, 75 pounds of corn and 20 pounds of rye, and you're doing it by weight, but the 75 pounds of corn, the corn grain is giving so much more starch than the rye grain, you're actually going to get so much more alcohol from the corn that your liquid ratios will end up being like, I don't know what the actual math is, but give it a whirl. 87, 88% corn, 10, 12% rye by liquid. So for ours are for the most part liquid volumes. So when we say we have a 64% rye, 32% corn, you might sit there and go, wow, well, that's pretty high corn content. Yes, but not by the standard that we're used to. By the mash bill standard, to do an American mash bill that yielded those liquid ratios, it would probably be more like an 80% rye. So people follow that. I know that's a little complicated, but we haven't had much to drink yet, so it's a little easier to follow at the moment.
Nick, one more question. So the question was asked, if each one is 17-year-old, is that the youngest component or is it an average?
Yeah, good question. So batch 3, to jump into batch 3 for a second, batch 3 is a 5 whiskey blend. We had a 17-year-old rye, 2 18-year-old ryes, a 21-year-old corn, and a 25-year-old corn. Actually, the 17-year-old rye made up a fraction of the whiskey. But by law, it has to be the youngest whiskey in there, is the age statement. I can't, I apologize. I can't disclose the distilleries at all. I can't say anything about them. We don't source from just one distillery, but in general, as much as we pound the table for transparency, it's actually a pet peeve of mine. I kind of think that should be the standard across the industry. You should say where your whiskey's from. You should say what it is. But unfortunately, most big distilleries will not even send you samples, let alone sell you anything if you don't sign an NDA. And that's very much the case for us. So we can't disclose it. One of my favorite things was we wanted to, if you've ever seen our bottles before, we have kind of I'll get a little closer, like a topographical map. People ask us all the time, like, oh, what's the map of? The map is of nothing. We wanted to make it of the first distillery that we ever sourced from, but there were 2 problems. One, there weren't any real mountains around it, so it wouldn't have had much of a map from a topography standpoint. But also, we asked them, and they were like, "Yes, that would be totally in violation."
Yeah, we should do. You should put like a small like rick house, maybe with 1 or 2 barrels, almost as a scavenger hunt, and then have people figure it out. Like, don't disclose it. Just whoever figures out shows up and drinks.
We're gonna do some Easter egg stuff in these whiskeys. We honestly, like, the amount of stuff I want to do and the stuff I actually have time to do is annoyingly there's a huge discrepancy. But so when we made batch 3, The interesting thing about batch 3 is this is actually the only whiskey we've made where none of the components use new American oak. There was Hungarian oak, there was ex-Speyside Scotch casks, there were ex-tequila casks, which was really funky. There was some Hungarian oak, and there was a little bit of used ex-bourbon barrels. But no new oak. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because it's actually one of my favorite features of batch 3. When we talk about whiskey, a lot of times people think whiskey is grain plus wood extraction, right? And that's kind of it, right? It's like grain plus wood extraction equals whiskey. But there's a really important part of the process, which is the oxidative part of the process. So if you did not charcoal the inside, if you didn't burn the inside of the barrel, nothing would happen. There'd be very, very little interaction with the wood. When you charcoal the inside of the barrel, you fundamentally change not only how much it will extract from the wood, you also affect how much it will take out. So charcoal is a natural filter. But the secret sauce of the charcoal that people don't talk enough about is charcoal actually polarizes oxygen. So oxygen is very stable. Thank God it's stable. If it weren't stable, we'd have trouble breathing. So it's a good thing that oxygen is a very stable molecule. But when oxygen actually interacts with the charcoal surface, when it interacts with charcoal surface, it polarizes it. So it messes with the electrons and makes it much, much more reactive. And the oxygen will actually start interacting with your different molecules that are in the whiskey itself. You produce aldehydes, you produce esters, you produce a lot of the lovely flavors that we actually like in whiskey. It's why, if you've ever tasted whiskey, God, how do I do this without insulting other brands?
Insult
if you've
them,
ever
it's okay.
Yeah, you're in the right crowd. Go for it.
I don't work with too many of these people. I can get in a lot of trouble. If you've ever worked with people, I guess, okay, who've used really small barrels, if you ever done it yourself, you put whiskey into a barrel that's like this big, right? It's
15 gallon barrel.
Yeah, these like tiny little barrels. You'll notice that the whiskey kind of tastes, it tastes on the front of the palate like bourbon, and then on the back of the palate it tastes like vodka. It's almost as if it hasn't integrated at all. And that's because it hasn't integrated at all. The oxygen is really important. You can't just pull the flavor out of the barrel. You can't just make whiskey in 5 days. I know there are people who are trying to do it, but they never get the oxidative process right. And then it tastes completely disjointed. It tastes like flavored vodka. It tastes like bourbon flavored vodka, right? It has no texture, it has no body, and it has no depth of flavor. That's the oxygen. So what's very cool about aging rye for 17, 18 years in non-new wood is you actually get to develop all of the really interesting fruit notes, but they aren't bombarded by a big caramel bomb, so you can taste them. So when we designed batch 3, we were actually trying to have it have a fundamentally spicy backbone from the rye, but actually have some of the fruit characteristics that can develop in rye, but you rarely see them because you rarely taste anything that's this old that doesn't already taste like a dining room table. Wood chips. So what do we think about this? Yes, no, don't like it, like it. It's 55.1% alcohol by volume, which was cast strength, non-chill filtered, natural color, obviously.
It's throwing my palate for a loop. I'm used to like a high ride corn mash bill, right? And so I keep getting confused thinking, oh, this is high ride, but the rye is on the front and there's a bit of sweetness on the back, and it drinks really smooth. I mean, you know, like 100, it drinks like 100 proof or lower.
Yeah, to say that it drinks really smooth.
So one thing for those of you who are here, which I guess anybody watches it and drinks along, but one thing that we do that's pretty abnormal from a blending standpoint is we actually blend at strength. So a little known fact in the industry is most blenders blend at 20%. I mean, I'm also talking about like any big distillery that's making bourbon that is doing quality control and they're blending barrels, they're doing it at 20%. They're effectively doing everything by nose. And so the reason they bring it down to 20%, and it makes plenty of sense, but the reason they bring it down to 20% is because at 20%, it's much, much easier to detect flaws. You can smell kind of if there's any kind of cardboard mustiness or any of the like weird flavors from something you've done wrong during distillation. And if you're just blending by flavor, it's subtle, but it actually, you're cutting all the ethanol out, so it makes it easier to do. Moreover, it makes it so that you can test like 50 different test batches in a row without getting really bad palate fatigue. We don't do that. We blend at strength. The reason we blend at strength is because honestly, we care so much about the texture, and at 20%, there is no texture. So when we made this, we were very much going for that really creamy mid palate. So this thing has like hearing you guys say it doesn't drink its proof is very affirming, because we really are going for that mid palate to be like, I mean, seriously, like all fat cream, right? Just crisp, bright with viscosity, with a little fat, which I don't know how people blend honestly, I don't understand how people blend for mouthfeel at 20%. It doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah, this is a cool whiskey.
Nick, quick question. Does Canada have the only first fill requirement as well?
First fill requirement? What is that? No, they don't have any. They have no fill requirements whatsoever. The rule that Canada has, that they were the first to put in, was any whiskey, any blended whiskey, any whiskey they make has to be at least 3 years old. So everything has to be at least 3 years old. It's one of the big misconceptions with Canadian whiskey, because American blended whiskey can have up to 80% NGS, so basically up to 80% vodka in it. Canadian whiskey actually was the first to create an age statement. The Scottish legislation that created the age minimum for Scotch was actually just based off of they just took the Canadian legislation, they just carbon copied it like 2 decades later or whatever it was.
Okay, good to know. And then if I'm jumping ahead, and I don't want to do that, but I think some of the batches we're going to taste further in this tasting are kind of based on batch 3, are they not?
Yeah, a little bit. I want to real quick, Paul. There is American oak. There's a lot of ex bourbon. There's a lot of American ex bourbon. It's just not new wood. It's not all new wood. If that makes sense. Paul asked why it says there's American oak. Yeah. So if you ever, if you buy a bottle of our, here we go. If you buy a bottle of our whiskey, you can't see it right now, but on it says maturation. It'll say American oak. The reason that we did that, the reason we didn't list out all the maturations is because it's so ugly when we do. The first label we designed, we wrote out like all of the components that were in the whiskey, and the label got like this long, and it just looked like a shopping list that my wife gives me when I'm going to the grocery store. It looks stupid. So what we did was, it was very simple. We just, in our blending process, we tend to build the whiskey around one component. Blending is tricky. Blending is very difficult, and it's gotten easier for us, but none of us were blenders when we started. And when we first started blending, there's just an infinite number of possibilities, right? I mean, literally, like if you have 15 samples and you can blend any number of them together at any ratio, you can do the math. We had a mathematician buddy of ours do it, and it was a lot of zeros. It was like 100 zeros of possibilities. It's just absurd. And so we actually went back and we had interviewed Brent Elliott at Four Roses as to how he makes small batch limited edition. And we watched his process and we adapted it for us, which was he gets very familiar with each of the lots, narrows it down to a handful that he can use, and then he starts conceptualizing how the flavors will interact before he even starts really doing any of the blending. That's way too cerebral, and maybe I can do that 20 years from now. But we did a modified version of that, which is we got really familiar with them. We pick one component and then we start sort of building off of that component based off what we're feeling is being accentuated well and what we're feeling the whiskey is missing. And we know, okay, this whiskey's adding fat, this whiskey's adding sweetness, this adding top notes, etc. And so when we decided to what would be on the label from a maturation standpoint, we always list what was the whiskey we were building around. This particular whiskey had a 21-year-old corn component, even though it's a rye, that was aged in ex-bourbon. The reason it was such an important component was spice to sort of these bright fruit notes. So if you had batch 3 and you got some of those like floral, beautiful fruit notes, when you blend spice with fruit, you need about a 6-to-1 ratio of top notes to spice. Otherwise, the spice completely takes over and you can't taste the fruit notes. So for us, when we were adding the corn component, we actually needed a corn component that was bringing fruit notes and bringing viscosity without bringing any spice, which is actually really, really difficult to find. We found this incredibly lovely 21-year-old corn that was aged exclusively in ex-bourbon barrels. And that was why we think it wasn't really throwing any wood spice. Because it was corn, it had all that meat and viscosity, that oiliness that corn has. And because it was 21 years old, it had actually developed all these lovely top notes. And so we were able to blend and sort of retain a lot of the fruit and bright notes that we were getting from the rye. Sorry, I hope that's not too much information for everybody.
Do you have a single barrel example of that 21-year-old corn you can ship out to us?
Yeah, I know. It's a great question, and honestly, that
I mean,
is
what you're describing there is something I really want now.
You would think so, and honestly, the crazy thing about it was when we first started blending, we thought, okay, I've got this really lovely whiskey and this really lovely whiskey. They're almost complete whiskeys, right? Like they've got everything. They've got the top notes, the body, and the base, right? They've got all three. And we got this other whiskey that's got all three. Let's put them together and see what happens. And it's amazing how muddled it gets. What we learned the hard way was components that do one thing or maybe two things very well, and then are missing the rest, blend really nicely. They fit really nicely with the whiskeys that are doing the opposite, right? That are also bringing one thing really well, but are relatively one note or two note whiskeys. And so this corn component, it's not that drinking it, like if you tasted it, you'd be like, yeah, it's flawless. And I don't mean that as in perfect. I mean flawless. There's no flaws in it. It's not, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's a very simple component, but it was the linchpin of creating this blend and using it effectively as the primer for the canvas, right? Like it unified it, it gave it body, it gave it some top notes, it allowed us to paint a really beautiful picture on top of it. But alone, it's just bland. So it's very interesting how that works. And when I discuss our single barrel program, you'll really understand why we did what we did. But I want to jump into batch 4 and kind of the darker half, the dark side of what we do here at Found North. So grab your batch 4 if you haven't already drank it. If you did while I was talking, I don't blame you. Batch 4 is 80% corn, 19% rye, 1% malted barley, which is actually the exact same grain ratio, which was an accident, that batch 2 was. Batch 2, So when we launched as a rye company. We were like, we're going to be a rye company. We're going to make rye, cast strength rye. There's no old cast strength rye. That's what we're going to bring to the table. That's going to be our thing. We made batch 1, which of course was a rye. It was a 16-year rye, 66% rye. And we started making batch 2 at a relatively similar grain liquid ratio, right? About 70% rye, 30% corn. We had this incredible corn component actually, and we were like, okay, let's use this same corn component that we used in batch 1. Let's use this corn component. We have this other rye that's really awesome. It's in ex-wheated bourbon barrels. Had this cool, like, sort of minty note to it that we really liked, and we were like, all right, cool, let's do this. And we blended it, and we're like, wow, this is great. And then we tried it at 65% rye, 35% corn, and it got better. And so then we tried it at 60-40, and it got better. And then we tried it at 55-45, and it got better. And then we tried it at 50-50, and we were like, all right, shit, we need to have a meeting. Because in, one more percentage point from here, we're no longer going to be legally rye. We can't call our liquid cast strength rye anymore, and we're moving into a category that doesn't exist. Not really from a Canadian standpoint, other than the Canadians might call it rye, or they would just call it blended whiskey, but that would be incredibly confusing to Americans. So we were like, okay, we got to have a conversation. And honestly, we settled on 80% corn, 20% rye. And it drank like a very bourbon adjacent whiskey, not exactly like bourbon, but similar. If you like bourbon, it was hitting that profile exactly. And we were like, this is fabulous. We love this whiskey. Will anyone buy it? Right? Like, that's the hard part about making whiskeys. You can make something that you love that's wonderful, but if it doesn't fit into a certain category, will people actually purchase it? Will we be, financially solvent enough to make batch 3 if we make this thing? and our attitude was like, we're gonna make this. We're gonna taste people on it. They're gonna try it, and they're gonna like it so much that we'll be fine, and we'll eventually sell out of it. And we'll make batches 3 and 4, and we'll still be selling 2, but that's okay because we'll have sold enough of it. And we just were like, all right, batch 2 will be this one-off thing that we do, and people who are in the know, who are, come to our tasting, stuff like that, they'll get a chance to taste it and they'll like it. We sold out of batch 2 in like a week. Batch 2 batch 2 took off. And honestly, in hindsight, it's pretty obvious why. There are 20 times as many bourbon drinkers as there are rye drinkers. So no kidding, we make something that drinks like a bourbon. People are going to like it. Which is why when we made batch 4, the intention was to make this cast strength whiskey. That's what we call it. We just call it cast strength whiskey, and we describe what's on there. And so batch 4 is a 4 whiskey blend. There are 2 18-year ryes. There's a 21-year corn, and there's a 25-year-old corn in there. It's 124.8 proof, so 62.4% alcohol by volume. The 25-year-old corn that was in Hungarian oak is the foundation of this whiskey. That's why it's the maturation that's on the bottle. And somebody asked about the proof range the base whiskeys were distilled to. The corn whiskeys tend to be distilled much higher than bourbon. So bourbon by law can't be distilled above 160. In Canada, they distill anywhere from 160 up to like 180, even 190. I don't know where these were. I don't think they were quite as high, but they don't tell us. In Canada, they call those higher proof whiskeys base whiskey, which I think is a marketing blunder to end all marketing blunders. I mean, truly, it's like, can you come up with something that's less appealing than the word base whiskey? Americans did. We call it light whiskey, which is even worse, because it really just gives you the sense that it has no character. But honestly, you can drink this and you immediately know, like, okay, I've been misled if I think that this has no character. In fact, it has way more of a sort of lovely, interesting molasses kind of corn quality to it, that is quite fun to play with. So that was why we made batch 2. This is why we made batch 4. Batch 4's been one of the more popular whiskey. Actually, we've done pretty well with all our whiskeys so far, but batch 4, from a I don't know, review standpoint, whatever you want to say, batch 4 won the John Barleycorn Best Canadian Whiskey this year, which was fun. I don't know, we don't put a ton of stock into we didn't put a ton of stock into the competitions until we started doing well in them, and then it was like, oh yeah, hey, no, so take that with a grain of salt. You know, if you prefer 3 or you prefer 5, I'm not gonna fault you for it. I don't think those guys are the be all end all.
Nick, I'll tell you this. Look, my knowledge of whiskey is way inferior to yours, but I like what I like. And just by comparing those two, 3 and 4, like 3 would be a typical rye drinker's rye. Like if you enjoy spice and if you enjoy heat, I think that would be up your alley. Not to say it's hot; it doesn't drink like it's proved. But 4, to your point, drinks a little bit more of a bourbon drinker's liquid. Like to me, it's a little bit more complex, just to my palate. I could be wrong. And I could totally see how 4 won all those awards. I think it's a little bit more ubiquitous than the 3 is.
Ubiquitous is the word. I completely agree. I think I get asked all the time what my favorite whiskey we've made is. And that's really hard. And I'm very moody about it. Sometimes it's really obvious for me, and sometimes it's not. I often come back to 3, but it's not because 3 rings a bell that I expect it to ring. 3 is not like 3 is not like eating a T-bone. You know, like you give me a T-bone, I'm a happy person. That's what 4 is for me. 4 is just like meaty. Let's dig in. I want to eat this.
4 is a filet mignon.
Yeah. Yeah. 3 is trickier. 3 is much more like
3 is prime rib. Right,
interesting. Yeah.
In comparison.
So, I really dig 3, but I get why 4 has had really broad appeal. Really broad appeal. Somebody, Paul says 4 still has a sizable amount of spice, even though it's much higher corn. Again, this is when the liquid ratio versus the grain ratio is really important. If you had a bourbon that had 80% corn and 19% rye, or whatever, it'd be 15% rye, it would drink a lot sweeter than this. This is showing a lot of spice because we're talking liquid ratios. To create this whiskey from a liquid ratio standpoint, you would have to be closer to like 65% corn, 35% rye. So the rye gets very featured in this at 19% because that's the liquid volume. Does that make sense? I know that I covered that at the beginning, and it has to do with the starch content.
And you did say, right, the 4 has barley in it in the mash bill.
1% barley in 4.
Only
1%.
Huh?
And that's just from the rye. That's the dirty little secret about enzymes is God, I shouldn't even say this. Most bourbon distilleries add enzymes. They just don't talk about it. Barley doesn't do everything, but it's important, and that's why, like, even though Canadians are using enzymes outright and very upfront about it, they still will put a little barley. The vice versa is true. Americans use barley. Oh, we use it's barley, but they will not say, and yeah, we throw in enzymes. And the reason is because if you think about it from a number standpoint, this is the same reason why so few brands talk about their grain, because they're not choosing grain for flavor. They're choosing grain for yield. If you make alcohol and you have to buy 500 tons and you buy 500 tons and it produces a 5% beer, your yield is going to be a tiny fraction of those 500 tons. If it's a 10% yield, you're going to get twice as much alcohol. If it's a 15% yield, you're going to get 3 times as much alcohol from that grain. And we're not just talking grain cost. The biggest cost of the distillery is heat, it's gas, it's fuel. There's a huge fuel cost. That's the biggest cost for all these guys. So if your grain can make a 1% by volume higher from like 7% alcohol by volume beer to 8% alcohol by volume beer, you think, oh, it's just 1%. No, that's a 12% increase in yield. It's huge. And so if you're using enzymes and that increases your yield by 20%, it increases your starch content by 20%, it makes you vastly more profitable. But you don't want to talk about it because there's this purity thing around whiskey of like, oh, I don't want it to be adulterated. And honestly, the enzymes don't do literally anything for the flavor. They just convert starch to sugar, and which is why the distilleries quietly do it. But they don't want to have to go through this whole process of explaining the economics to you, so they don't say it. So there's a little bit of barley a lot of times in Canadian rye, and there's a lot of bit of enzymes in your American whiskeys.
Where else are you gonna get this info? Does everyone do it? Or others?
They don't tell you, but I've talked to, the industry has a problem with keeping secrets. It's called alcohol. We all talk to each other, but we always talk to each other when we're drinking, and then we say shit that we shouldn't say to each other. So I've talked to a ton of people who make whiskey, and they're like, yeah, we add enzymes. We just don't say it.
Interesting. Okay.
It's the science behind it, so it's okay.
Good to know. Yeah. Listen, I can't say I blame them, but it's nice to know.
Question about residual sugar. No, the residual sugar doesn't pass over at all. In fact, really interesting. This is one of my favorite things in whiskey in general, actually, and it's one of the reasons that I love working with Canadian whiskeys. The reason why the enzymes were such a revolution for Canadian whiskey is because you basically, if you think about whiskey, the flavor comes from combinations of acids and alcohols. You create certain acids during fermentation, you create certain alcohols during distillation, right? And so during fermentation, particularly in a place like Scotland, if you go to Scotland and you go on a tour, a lot of times you'll see stainless steel and wooden washbacks at the same distillery. And if you get really geeky into their process, what you'll find is the stainless steel washbacks, they do a short fermentation, usually 48 hours, which is about as much time as it takes for the yeast to consume every little molecule of sugar that's in the wort, in the sugary water that they put in, right? Meanwhile, their wooden washbacks, they're doing like 100-hour fermentation. Why? Right? Like, why the hell would you do that? It doesn't make any sense. If all the sugar is consumed in 48 hours, why are you letting it sit for another 52 hours? Why are you letting it sit for another 3 days? The reason is that a huge impact on the flavor of whiskey is what's called the microflora and fauna, right? It is the unique bacteria that is localized to the distillery, and in some cases localized to the exact fermentation tank. And here's the really sciencey, geeky stuff. Basically, when yeast runs out of sugar, it starts to lose this billion-year-long battle between yeast and bacteria. A lot of times people say yeast is a bacteria. It's not. Yeast and bacteria are mortal enemies. And when yeast has plenty of sugar, it can fight off bacteria very easily. When yeast runs out of sugar, the bacteria starts to win. What yeast cells do to protect themselves from bacteria is they go through a process called autolysis, which is basically they eat themselves. They self-destruct. And in doing so, they release a lot of acid that kills the foreign bacteria. In that process, they develop a lot of the acids that create the flavors that go into our whiskey. It's one of the reasons why actually the particular subspecies of bacteria that lives in the distillery is so important to the eventual flavor. It's why people like Bill Lumsden say, if we took Ardbeg and we took Glenmorangie and we just flipped them, we just took the distilleries from Islay and the distillery from Tain in the Highlands, and we just took the whole facilities and switched them, we couldn't create the same whiskey. We couldn't create Glenmorangie on Islay, and we couldn't create Ardbeg in Tain. And the reason is not because of the air or the water or any of this crap. It's actually because the flora and fauna that create the exact flavors are so unique to that place. They're so unique to that local spot. So that is a really long-winded way of saying, actually, there's no residual sugar that makes its way through the distillation process. Any residual sugar that you might get in whiskey is actually gonna come from wood sugars, natural wood sugars.
Well,
Todd Leopold is the man. Todd Leopold knows more about yeast. He is the man. But I will say Lumsden, who has 2 PhDs in fermentation science, is another dude to geek out with. I've had the pleasure a few times. Actually, the other guy who knows so much about grain and yeast and is a mad genius with this is Matt Hoffman. Hoffman, I've had the pleasure of interviewing a couple times, and he's like, God, he's not the most sociable dude, but lordy lord, does he know a lot about whiskey and about yeast and wood, and yeah, he's a cool dude. All right, I digress. Batch 5. Okay, so batch 5 is a brand new batch. I'm obsessed with batch 5. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's a a moment in time thing. Right now, batch 5 is my favorite whiskey, right? It's not necessarily always my favorite whiskey, but at the moment, batch 5 is what I'm primarily drinking. I'm going to dump my glass real quick so I can pour some batch 5 in it. All right. So with batch 5, we had done batch 1 and batch 3 as ryes. But because we released the single barrel this year, which we'll taste at the end, because we released the single barrel as a rye this year, we were going to do we were very happy to do sort of something different with batch 5 and not have it be another rye expression. And so with batch 5, I wrote this in the copy. If you go to our website, if you go to foundnorthwhiskey.com and you go to our whiskeys and you read the copy, it's a little flowery. You would be shocked that someone who talks as much as me also talks too much in writing. It's a little loquacious and kind of overdone. But I talk about why we made batch 5, and one of the things that I said is like when you're blending a whiskey, sometimes you're very much constructing it. Sometimes you're like you're shaping the whiskey incredibly intentionally. Other times, whiskey doesn't always work 1 + 1 = 2. Sometimes 1 + 1 = 5. Whiskey doesn't blend. That's one of the fun things about it. A lot of times you're kind of following a trail. That was the case with batch 5. We had this insanely delicious component. It was an 8-year-old wheat component that was aged exclusively in new wood. So all 8 years in new American oak. And it was one of the most delicious whiskeys we've ever had as a component by itself. It was just phenomenal. A little fiery, but just really, really good. And so when we were blending it, the goal wasn't to build the whiskey around it and add all of these different things. The goal was don't screw it up. We had very simple goals with batch 5. We wanted a little bit more age. And what I mean by that is we wanted the oiliness and viscosity and the really old corn whiskeys, which we used a 21-year corn to be the sort of partner batch with the partner component with batch 5. These really old corn components, they have this mouthfeel that just lingers, just hangs around. If you've ever seen Rounders, it's like hanging around, like it's got alligator blood, right? It's like it just sits there forever.
Kid's got alligator blood, can't get rid of him.
And so what we really were trying to do was take this beautiful 8-year-old component and lay it on top of a foundation of a beautiful kind of old 21-year whiskey. And we had this corn whiskey that had spent actually just under 9 years in New American Oak, the rest in ex-bourbon. And we combined them, and it was like, okay, we don't have to do anything else to it. So this thing is 73% 21-year corn and 27% 8-year-old wheat. And again, that's by liquid, not by mash bill, right? Those are liquid ratios. So it was 100% wheat. There was no barley in either of these components. It's 116.2 proof. And this is our first ever wheated expression. Somebody
It's
asked,
funny, doesn't
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I say it doesn't
Christian.
actually remind me of what I think typically of a wheated bourbon, like an Old Elk or somebody else that does them. But it's a little hot up front, but it's extremely smooth. But it doesn't remind me, when I think of a typical wheated bourbon, it doesn't really. It's unique. I like it. It almost reminds me of a cognac finish. That another one did. I really get, if I was doing a blind tasting, I would think this is what's that one in New York with the dog on the label?
Taconic.
Taconic. So I would, if I was doing a blind tasting, I would probably pin that this is probably that one. It's really good.
I think one of the main reasons this doesn't drink like most wheaters you'll have is because so the blast that you get right off the bat is very much the wheat. 8 years old isn't particularly young, but it's substantially younger than 21 years old. And effectively, the older a whiskey gets, it tends to get stretched out. It tends to just stretch the whiskey out, right? So that the way you taste the whiskey, it tends to evolve more. It tends to have it's just a longer whiskey, right? The experience isn't that kind of brief burst. The kicker with a wheated expression that you would get like a wheated bourbon is the older you make the whiskey, the further you get away from the grain, right? So if you ever look at a graph of bourbon, you'll see the different, if you actually look at a flavor graph, if you ever, one of my favorite whiskey books, actually my favorite whiskey book is by Lou Bryson. It's called Tasting Whiskey. I actually know what page this graph is on. It's on page 59 of Tasting Whiskey. And you can actually see, swear to God, you can see the different flavor components and the profiles and what goes up and what goes down based off of how old the whiskey is. So with grain flavor, obviously the grain flavor, well, maybe not obviously, but obviously to me, the grain flavor goes down over time. You wouldn't be surprised to discover that wood flavor goes up over time, right? And continues to go up. So what's fascinating about doing a blend the way we did it is you get 8-year-old wheat. You get actual wheat, right? That like Irish butter, minty leather, really what I love about wheat. But you also get this kind of clean, longer tasting, more developed, a little bit more fruit note, 21-year-old whiskey that it gets to kind of sit on. So in my mind, you get the best of both worlds. You get both the maturity, but also the loveliness of the grain. Michael, you're gonna have to Amazon Prime a copy of Tasting Whiskey, and you can call me on it if I'm wrong.
Guess what I'm doing right now. See, when I tasted this batch, I actually did get wheat. That initial blast, I actually did get wheat. So I could see the cognac comment for sure, but to me, like, it's quite obvious that there's some wheat component in this.
For me, when I taste wheat, I taste it's always Irish butter. It's that slightly tangy buttery note, right? Like Irish butter has just a little bit more tang to it than regular butter. That's how I always think of Irish butter. I don't know other people. I eat the little Kerrygold with my toast in the morning. I don't know about you guys. But like I always think of Irish butter, and that's really what I get whenever I have wheated expressions, and that's what why this reminds me of wheated bourbon. But I totally get the some of the long sweetness of something like a cognac cask is going to come from that 21-year corn component. Sweet butter on toast, yes.
My wife buys those Irish butters from Costco in truckloads. So yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Costco.
Put a pad that in your coffee in the morning.
Yes. I put
really
vanilla ice cream in my coffee. I'm
Yeah.
I'm really funny. I get up in the morning, I make my eggs, I make my coffee. I immediately grab vanilla ice cream out of the freezer. I eat ice cream with a fork. Whiskey. Ice cream should be eaten with a fork. It's so much better, gives it more texture, and it's easier. I don't know why we break spoons off when we could just be using a fork. I take a little bit from myself right into my coffee. Then I give one to one dog and another forkful to the other dog, and then I go to work. All right, so so should we dive into batch 6? Feels like a good time. Any questions at this point?
I compared 2 and 4, and if I was going to blind taste them and read the labels, I would have swapped them.
Really?
2 was hotter, and 4 is like my 1 or 2 for the year right now. It's in 1 or 2 slot, and 2 is good, but I would have actually swapped the flavor profile. I don't know if it was the Hungarian oak that makes that what it is, but yeah, I would have absolutely swapped the 2.
We have so many. It's interesting because we have a lot of people who swear by 2 and a lot of people who swear by 4. I find that 2 it's more of a burst.
Yeah.
There's a huge burst of flavor, and 4 is much more stretched out. And I think it's the 25-year Hungarian oak component takes that profile up a notch, and it just stretches out. Which actually is a nice little segue into 6. So, to be honest, like batch 2, batch 4, and now batch 6, this profile it's kind of become what it's sort of our signature now. We've been making this profile. The whiskeys are relatively similar. More so 1 and 3, I think, are more different from each other. And then obviously batch 5 is this whole new thing. But 2, 4, and 6 have been a very intentional evolution. So when we made batch 6, we very much had what did 2 and 4 do and where can we go from there, if you get what I'm saying. So with batch 6 is a 5 whiskey blend. There are actually 3 corn components in it.
Ooh.
There's a 17-year, a 21-year, and a 26-year. We used the foundations of both batch 2 and batch 4. So the meat of batch 2 and the meat of batch 4, including that really old Hungarian oak, are actually the base of batch 6, which was really fun because they've gotten a little older, so they've changed a little bit. And then we used an 18-year and a 19-year rye. The 18-year rye is also aged in Hungarian oak. We really built this around that 18-year rye, even though it's such a minority component. It honestly was so spicy that we really just were designing the whiskey around it. And so that's why on the label it says Hungarian oak is the primary maturation. It is 128.2 proof. It it is 87% corn. So we brought the corn component up a little bit. So it's 87% corn, 12% rye, 1% malted barley. And I mean, you guys are digging in, but for me, the big thing on this whiskey is this thing is fat. It just is. It's the weightiest whiskey we've made so far, and I don't mean highest proof. Actually, batch 2 was a little bit higher proof. I just mean literally when you drink it, it has so much weight to it, so much heaviness to it, so much viscosity, oiliness. Yeah, this is a fun whiskey, and to me it smells like just like fresh out of the microwave. I am sitting down to watch a long movie. Popcorn, molasses, butter, maple syrup, and
Hey,
nutmeg.
Dumb question for you.
Hit me with a dumb question.
So I don't know how you guys do this stuff, but so you've got batch 3.
Yeah.
Is batch 3 going to be around forever, or
No.
is it till you run out of your blend and then you'll make?
No, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that, Matt. That's a great question. No, that's not what we're doing, and not what we were going for. In fact, we really, there are 2 reasons. We really like the idea of the ephemeral nature of whiskey, right? Like, I personally, I think one of the coolest things about whiskey is that sort of idea of there's a finite amount of it. It is very much it's very much like life, right? It's very much this whiskey's very much about enhancing the moment. My grandfather used to say, life's a bunch of bullshit with the cherry on top, right? And it's basically like life's all about the cherry. Life's always all about like those moments, those things that stick with you that are really significant to you. When you have a rare whiskey, and it doesn't need to be a rare collectible whiskey, I just mean a kind of a one of a kind whiskey, something that's unique to you, something that's personal to you. The concept of, all right, I have this bottle, I have this finite amount of liquid, and when it's gone, it's gone. And I'm going to pick the people that I choose to drink it with, and I'm going to pick the time that I'm going to choose to drink it with. That is the essence. For me, that's the essence of whiskey. That's what I like about it. That's what drew me to the category. It's what drew me to the business in general. The other thing is, for us, people all the time ask us, like, why do distilleries sell you these weird, like, really delicious components, right? Like, why aren't they using them for their whiskey? And part of the reason is because we're often buying distilleries' experiments. If you are going to explore the concept of Hungarian oak or ex tequila barrels or ex wheated bourbon barrels or any of the things that have been featured in our whiskeys, you don't just go, all right, cool, let's lay down 7,000 casks of that. That seems good. You test it, right? You say, all right, let's take 13, 14-year-old whiskey. Let's transfer in here for 4 or 5 years. Yeah, Jamie, right? All in, right? No, you say, all right, let's do 5 of these casks and let's see how they evolve over the next few years. And if we love it, we can start a whiskey or we can start a program that we can build a brand around. But distilleries that are selling us this stuff, what are they going to do with even 50 casks of this stuff? They're looking at volumes in the tens of thousands of cases land, right? Not in a few thousand bottles land. And so they're actually pretty happy for us to take them off their hands, to clear their books of it. And that's why we can get really quality whiskey. It's not this, a lot of times, I think one of the reasons that people, as brands have been so scared, why brands have been so scared to say that they're sourcing their whiskey is because the fear they have that the consumer will assume if a distillery is selling you this stuff, it's their worst shit. And that's just not the case, right? The challenge, of course, is if we make something that we love, we can't recreate it. Right? We can't just go back and go, cool, can we have like 10 more of those ex-wheated bourbon barrels? Can we have, that it doesn't exist. So for us, there's both a kind of a romantic aspect that we really enjoy, but there's also a logistical nightmare for us, which is we are forced to keep recreating new whiskeys every time. So if you love one of our batches, buy a case. No, but you get my point, right? Like it's hard for us to recreate it, and we don't want to.
I mean, to some degree, this is not unlike being an enthusiast for a single barrel selections, right? I mean, you're kind of getting one piece unique, as
Totally.
I call it. It's just one of one. That's it.
Totally. Yeah, and I think when we dive into single barrel, we can talk about that. But what I'm really curious about is, people here are drinking 4 and 6, but also I know some of you have had 2. I'm curious what you guys think about 6, because we've had people raving about 6, and I can't decide which is my favorite. Sometimes 4 is my favorite, sometimes 2 is my favorite, and then sometimes I'm like, oh shit, 6 is my favorite. So I'm really curious. And by the way, if you do have a water dropper next to you, I ironically don't. This thing opens up like crazy with even just a drop or 2 of water. And if anyone's interested in the chemistry on that, I'm happy to share.
Yeah.
Please share.
Okay. All right. So one of the big questions you always get, right, is like, at least for me, is like ice, water, neat, right? That's the big, that's the big question. And my answer is always the same. If you buy it, you do whatever the hell you want with it. But in general, for me personally, I put my whiskey on the rocks all the time. And people go, oh my God, you put your whiskey on the rocks? It's over $100. Like, no way. It's like, well, yeah, because I'm not always like psychoanalyzing my whiskey. I'm not always sitting here. I actually, when I'm blending, I will put my noise canceling headphones on, a blindfold on, and I will sit with whiskey in a dark room with the blindfold on, like super analyzing the whiskey. But guess what? That's not how I enjoy whiskey most of the time. Sometimes I like to sit on the deck and drink a whiskey. And if it happens to be 80 out, I'm going to put an ice cube in it. Don't throw rocks at me. But no, I think like the truth though is when you put ice in it, you chill it, which makes it harder to taste. You also dilute it inconsistently, right? So you're changing the rate at which it's diluting, and you're changing the dilution level. However, when you put a drop of water in your whiskey, several things happen. First of all, you lower the ABV, which if you're tasting too much ethanol, that's a good thing, right? Your palate has these things called nociceptors. Nociceptors are what feel texture and what react to literally pain. It's what's telling your brain like, ow, you put something hot on my mouth. It is the same reaction that the reaction to whiskey is the same reaction that you have to jalapenos, literally. And in the same way that you can get used to jalapenos, you can get used to whiskey. But if your natural tolerance isn't 128.2 proof, bringing it down a little will make it easier to taste. 2 other things that are happening. One, the alcohol is not perfectly water soluble. In fact, alcohol is a little bit hydrophobic, not hydrophilic, right? Like it doesn't actually mesh perfectly, and it causes an endothermic reaction. It heats up the liquid. When you put a drop of water in, you're physically heating up the whiskey. Warmer whiskey is actually easier to taste. Lastly, if you have a Glencairn or even a rocks glass and you have something, particularly if it's non-chill filtered, if you put a few drops of water in it, you'll see a bunch of oils precipitating on the top of the glass. A lot of that is guaiacol, which is like the savory, delicious note that you get. So you are physically opening up the whiskey. So I highly recommend a drop of water in most whiskeys, particularly cask strength whiskeys. I will say the one thing I will say is if you're ever lucky enough to drink like a super aged scotch, I'm talking 40-plus-year-old scotch, even at like, if it's at cask strength, sometimes they're at like cask strength 41.5%, because they're losing more alcohol than water. I find if I add water, it disintegrates. It like loses all its texture and all its flavor almost immediately. It's bizarre. And that's kind of the only time that I really strongly recommend drinking it neat.
I've seen a chart that compares maturation to a flavor profile of both scotches and bourbons. And the longer liquid stays in the barrel, in the wood for bourbon, the more oakier it gets. Like, and that's true. Like if you guys ever had a 23, 25-year-old bourbons, they're oaky, right? It's an oak bomb. And with scotches, it's the opposite effect. It actually smooths out that oakiness and it becomes quote unquote more elegant.
Wood maturation is really interesting because so much of the actual extraction happens in the first 6 to 12 months, or really most of it by 18 months. But then what starts to happen is you get concentration, where certain things are if you have a 1-to-1 ratio, but this one is the one that's evaporating and this one isn't, you're concentrating the hell out of this flavor. So that can get particularly interesting with particularly really old stuff, like really old scotch. You also will get super molecularly light compounds, which evaporate really quickly. So one fun fact is whiskey doesn't, when you open a bottle of whiskey, so I have this bottle that's half open, this is not oxidizing. People say, oh, your whiskey oxidizes in the bottle. No, this is not oxidizing. Ethanol is too stable. This is not oxidizing, but it is evaporating. So a lot of your floral notes, a lot of your bright notes they literally have physically low molecular weight. And so they'll evaporate into this bottle. And when I open them, they all escape. And now this thing will evaporate to equilibrium again, which is why when you get your bottle down to like a quarter full, if you really care about the whiskey, you should either finish it or transfer it into a smaller glass that doesn't have near as much headspace. So the last whiskey you guys have is a really fun one. So we created our quote unquote single barrel program. Crap, I forget who asked earlier, but somebody said, oh, it'd be great to get a single barrel of that 21-year corn component. Yeah. It wouldn't. No, it would not. It would not be that exciting a whiskey, unfortunately. And that was an issue for us because we really wanted to do a single barrel program. And more than that, for us, we view ourselves as blenders. We really, we feel like, for obvious reasons, the two places where we really add value is one at the blending level, and then one, of course, at the maturation level, because we can further mature things. And so for us, it was, how do we create a single barrel program, but also sort of stick to our ethos and stick to our brand as blenders and really add value from a maturation standpoint. And so we came up with an idea last December, which was, or a little bit before then, but it went into effect in December. We created a blend. So we created a blend of 12-year-old rye, 19-year-old rye, and 21-year-old corn. It was 50% 12-year-old rye, it was 20% 19-year-old rye, and it was 30% 21-year corn. And the blend very intentionally was created, we say, like, with space for wood. So we made it, if a whiskey is on the 1 to 10 scale of oakiness, we tried to make something that was in the 2 to 3 range, not the 8 or 9 range. You get the idea, right? We wanted there to be a lot of space for it to grow into having more wood extraction and having more wood. We created that blend and recast it into 18 different barrels. And effectively, each barrel was different. The idea behind it was we'll do these further maturations, and we will get, not only will we get 18 different single barrels, 18 different barrels that don't taste like each other, but beyond that, this is not a blend that exists on the market. So it's really fun to do a single barrel, but when you do a single barrel of something that you can go buy the regular version of, a lot of times they're not that different, right? And that's by design. For us, we were like, all right, how cool would it be if you're a barrel picking club or you're a great account and you do your single barrel to really have a whiskey be kind of a one of a kind whiskey. So we ended up putting them into all kinds of things. So we did New American Oak, but we also did port, we did sherry barrel, we did Muscat, we did Sauternes, cognac, Calvados. The list goes on. We did one gigantic, fat, juicy sherry butt, and we have saved this to be kind of a release for our mailing list only, which is what we did with Barrel One. And so effectively we created a one of a kind sherry butt aged rye. It is a single barrel in the sense that it came from one barrel. So for folks who are purists, bourbon purists, this would be sacrilegious, right? Because the whiskey didn't all come from one barrel for its entire life. But from basically every other category, including Canadian, including Scotch, including everywhere else where they're mixing barrels all the time, this would be the definition of single barrel in the sense that all the liquid came from one barrel and it truly is a one of one whiskey. So you guys are getting actually a sneak peek of our sherry butt. And we will release this as a DTC only. We were thinking about doing it as a holiday release. We're not sure if we're going to do it in the holidays or just right after them. Honestly, it's a combination of when things are arriving where. We have a lot of whiskey going to a lot of places right now, so it doesn't exactly make sense to slam everyone with a whole nother release. But we may do it anyway, just at the nick of time. So give this a try and then ask me questions and let's go here.
I tried it. I love it, actually, honestly. I think it's excellent. And I think it's everything you just discussed, just in terms of maintaining your ethos, maintaining your, brand profile, but then introducing that finish. And, that's kind of full circle as how we started this conversation about finishes and bourbons and whiskeys. It doesn't, to me at least, it has presence, so you can totally smell and feel the sherry, but I think it enhances the whiskey. It doesn't detract or overpower it. That's what I'm getting with it. And the finish on it quite long, and the finish is also sherry heavy. It's kind of lingers in your mouth and kind of remind, like, to me that would be a perfect aperitif, honestly. Like after a meal, you drink something like this and just kind of enjoy and kick back.
Okay, so I love drinking it after dinner, which is really bad because I shouldn't have started taking bottles out of the batch because out of the single barrel, because we really didn't make that much of it, and I've already drank like 2.5 bottles of it. I've been misbehaving. But honestly, after dinner, it's just like, yeah, it's so fun. It's such a fun whiskey. It's tricky because if you expect this to taste like any rye you've ever had, you're gonna be thrown off. But if you treat it that way and you're like, I love rye and I want something for dessert that has some serious sweetness, it's like it is dried out, jammy preserves. Everybody's notes on here are right on the money. Spicy jam, grape raisin palate with sweet vanilla. Totally agree. Wow, this is dessert. Yep, exactly. Assaulted by a group of sweet but angry pears wielding spicy clubs. Yeah, that sounds about right. That's what we're going for, guys.
I
Everyone
didn't
knows
even
that.
see the comments, and that's what I got.
The comments
Yeah.
are awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
You know,
what we're
like
going
for the people on the line, if you guys ever bought our what was it, barrel bourbon finished
Yeah.
in PX cask, that's what this reminds me of a little bit. That one was also like a very desserty and very delicious whiskey. Yeah.
This is a PX sherry, but PX sherry
Oh.
being so Pedro Jimenez is
There you go.
the super sweet sherry butt. It was also one fun. So the interesting thing about barrel finishes is there are basically a couple ways you can do it. One of the primary ways to do it is what's called a dechar rechar, or just people just say rechar, which is effectively you're stripping away the inside of the barrel, all the char, and then you're recooking the barrel. In which case, very obviously, you're not going to get any of the previous liquid lying around when you've cooked it. So what's effectively important is the wood species and what the previous spirit extracted from the barrel, right? We talked a little bit about hydrolysis, ethanolysis at the beginning. The other primary type of barrel finishing is a wet cask, right? Which literally means you dump the barrel, you then fill it as quickly as possible. So we did a bunch of wet casks, and you really get the kind of juicy sweetness from the PX sherry. It really comes through. But then, of course, it's still pretty heavy, oaky characteristic, right? So it's taking all of that lovely sweetness, that nutty sweetness, that spiciness, and it's drying it out a little bit, which is why we're getting so much of that kind of jammy fig raisin. And then of course with the wood you get more vanilla. So it's like drizzling raspberry puree over ice cream, which is just pretty much my favorite thing in the world. And we will be doing something. It won't be this barrel, but we'll be doing something pretty fun with Prime Barrel. I don't want to give away too much, but
you don't have to give away too much. But I will use this opportunity to kind of hype up that little experiment as a part of our premium membership program that you guys heard so much about, and I've spoken ad nauseum on Discord. We partnering with Nick and Zach and their team, and we're going to do a bespoke blend just exclusively for us. And the guys who buy the membership will have an opportunity to join us to go up to Boston area somewhere.
Yes.
And do this in person with Nick. So as you guys know, or actually gotten sense of, Nick knows a lot about whiskey. So he's going to walk us through this entire experience. He's going to lead, I should say, the entire experience, because none of us know crap about blending whiskey. He does, but we'll definitely be, lend our palates to this project, and the finishing result, we won't leave there until all of us are happy with the finishing result. So I'll leave it at that. Now, obviously, we can't take everybody. Hold on a second. Now, we can't take everybody.
Yeah.
But the members will get the first dip, and we'll just do a random drawing and pick, small group of people and do it.
More importantly, we'll have Sammy, who's our director of whiskey innovation.
Oh yeah.
I often joke, and it's only 80% true, that Sammy does all the work and I get all the credit. But Sammy is on our team. He's been with Found North since its founding, and he very, very much is a huge part of creating our test blends. So this would be a really fun process, because you're gonna have both of us, you're gonna have the full team, and we're gonna create a damn good whiskey. But you guys are gonna get the chance to really impact the funnel flavor, which is, I think, kind of the most fun, right? Like, that's kind of the point of picking single barrels, is to be a part of the process and to feel very a part of the process. So we're trying to extend that a little bit and do it in a way where we still make really good whiskey, honestly, it's tricky to make an entire blend in a day. So we're gonna cheat a little and accelerate the process in a few spots, but it's gonna be a blast.
A side little anecdote about involving club members in blending. We actually did a bespoke blend with Black Button guys, and for them, they do it all the time. But for them, it was the first time they did it virtually because that was the whole idea. Let's involve people from the comfort of their own home. So they sent out the samples, but the samples were diluted. It was like 94 proof, and that didn't really go over well with this demographic. And it didn't really did the whiskey any justice because I've had their cast strength expressions, and it wasn't nearly as good. So long story short, they rethought the whole process. They resent us the cast strength samples, but the way they do it, and I think Nick, I've shared that with you a little bit. They have a base blend that you don't even get to taste. Like the majority of the blend consists of that base blend. And then they add on these little components, and they have 3 different vats. And each vat is specific to a certain tasting note: spice, sweet, and oak. And as a group, we were able to play around with, I guess, percentages of those 3 components, which then they took back to their master blender, and he incorporated it with the base blend. And whoever got in the bottle, I've heard nothing but rave reviews about it. It turned out actually pretty good. So now that we've done this and had this experience, I feel like your program is a natural step up from that, where you guys actually are going to blend stuff in front of us. So that's I'm looking forward to it, just to say the least.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the process of how to do this in a way where you can really experience the different phases of it, and also experience the feeling like you're finalizing the product, right? It's one thing to say, okay, I kind of like this and this, and then you guys go finish it. I really don't want it to be like that. On the flip side, if we just sat down for an hour and threw together a blend, it wouldn't be very good. So how do you sort of put that together? And also, how do you have the experience of getting an idea of what the job actually is like? So when we do it, we will test components, we will test blends, and we will do physical actual blending. We will really make some of our own blends, and that's how we will get to the final product. So
That's awesome.
I'm pumped. We're gonna have a lot of fun.
And as Steve Jobs would say, and there's one more thing. I love your bottles, by the way. I think the typography thing, and I was only half joking about doing the scavenger hunt with this. I think you should definitely consider it.
I'm seriously.
The label itself, that front label on their the front label on their bottle, on that bottle that we're going to blend, will actually be very exclusive to our club again, and is going to have elements of our NFT art. And I think the scene that the guys picked from all of those scenes that you guys are voted on fits perfectly to their brand. We've been talking and drinking whiskey for about an hour and a half. I do want to start wrapping this up. If you guys have any questions for Nick, I think this is the time. You guys feel free to unmute yourself. It doesn't have to be just through chat. So we'll use the next 5 minutes for Q&A if you have any questions. If not, I guess I'll let everybody get back to their evenings.
Quick question: How often do you do new batches?
It's a good question. We did the first batches in April 2021. The second release of batches 3 and 4 were supposed to come out in September or October last year, but in the middle of COVID, we had so much horrible logistics nightmares. It came out in the beginning of December, which was not ideal at all. Basically missed all of the best time to sell your whiskey. This year we timed it up pretty effectively. So we landed in, October, early November for sort of the holiday rush. But we've been thinking about when people really want whiskeys to be released. I'm actually curious what everybody in here thinks, because for us, it just feels like there's so many whiskeys that come out in November-ish that it might be actually fun to start seeing some whiskeys coming out a little more off cycle. I think we're really itching to release something, if not a new batch, but something in April next year. because honestly, like people who are drinking our whiskey are not just seasonal drinkers. You know what I mean? They're not just like, oh, okay, it's getting sort of warm, so I'm putting the stuff away till November next year. It's like, no. Most people who we're selling to like whiskey, and drink it all the time.
I'm a Four Seasons drinker.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm talking about. So we may change it up. We've laid carefully laid plans in the past, and they've gone awry. Boom, boom.
Well, with that being said, I thank everyone for joining, and I specifically want to thank our guest of honor, Nick. Thank you for the knowledge. Thank you for your willingness to provide these samples to the members. I think this is great, and I hope you've made however many people were on the call, that many more fans of your brand. So, with that being said, guys, have a good night, and cheers.
Cheers. Good night, everybody.
Thank
you so much.
Bye.